Hey there, my name is Rachael Kalaki.
I'm Annie.
And I'm Shelby. And welcome to the Magdala Podcast.
We know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem.
The need for women to be accompanied in their journey toward healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here.
Magdala is a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom from sexual addiction through support, community, and accountability.
Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to discussions on how to live fully as a Catholic woman.
You are not alone, and wherever you are on your journey, we welcome you to this table.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Magdala Podcast. It's Rachael with a solo episode today, which means, yes, you get to be the victim of one of my rants. Well, okay, not totally ranty, but kind of. That's how solo episodes just tend to feel. I feel like I'm ranting into the void, but here goes nothing. To kick off our season, we wanted to talk about something that comes up in Magdala a lot, but also is near and dear to my heart, and that's talking about the processing of purity culture. So when I say the phrase purity culture, maybe you have a reaction of, I know exactly what this is. I can think of exact messages, books, people even who spread these messages to me. I know the harms that it caused in my life. I know the benefits maybe it brought me. Or maybe you're unsure what purity culture is. And over the past year, I'd say I've been doing some more intentional research into the messages of purity culture, their theological incompatibilities with Catholicism, and sometimes their root origins, or whatever you want to call it. Where did they come from? Where did they come from? This is my postpartum brain recording an episode. Where did the lies of purity culture come from? So I've been doing some research. One of the things that I did was I reread a lot of popular purity culture resources, or I reread a lot of the things that I was given in my own catechesis growing up by the church. And some of those things I would consider to be aligned with tenets of purity culture. Other things I wouldn't. Sometimes it's a mix of both. But I also read a lot of resources that other people told me they attributed to purity culture. Another thing I did to research these questions was I surveyed a lot of random women on their experiences of purity culture. I asked them questions about the messages they received about their bodies, their sexuality, their virginity, the behavior that they were supposed to achieve, or how they were supposed to conduct themselves in relationships, the effects of purity culture in their life, whether positive, negative, somewhere in between, and what was most beneficial or harmful to them about being raised in the culture that they were. So after all of this, this research, this taking in of information, I'm still in the midst of it. I have compiled a definition of purity culture that I think might be helpful. This is pretty general. I think I could get a little more fine-tuned about this, but this is my operating definition right now. So if you're one of the people who's like, I don't know what you're talking about when you say the phrase purity culture, here's what I want to give you. Purity culture is a distortion of the true teachings of the Catholic Church that made sexual purity the highest virtue and sexual impurity the gravest sin, by depending on fear and shame-based rhetoric and methods surrounding sexual education and catechesis. So again, purity culture is a distortion of the true teachings of the Catholic Church that made sexual purity the highest virtue and sexual impurity the gravest sin, by depending on fear and shame-based rhetoric and methods surrounding sexual education and catechesis. With that, there are the three most harmful effects that I see of purity culture that I'm going to note right now. One, it told us that sexuality is the locus of both the gravest sin and the most blissful joy. So sexuality is either perfection or destruction. There is no in between. You're either loving or lustful. There is no in between. Just basically, it's a complete binary. You're either in it or you're not. You're either pure or you're not. Second, men are inherently more lustful, and therefore the duty of women is to protect them from themselves, essentially, resulting in a lot of harmful effects for women specifically that I'll get into a little bit. And three, the last one I want to focus on is that the lie that marriage will solve all of your sexual problems. And again, these are the three main things resulting from purity culture, main effects that I noticed in my generation and people a little bit older than me, definitely people younger than me. These are the three main conclusions I'm seeing people still kind of walk around with as a result of what I would say is purity culture. There are many harmful effects, including a ton that came up in the surveys of women. I interviewed some of these women personally, had conversations with them about how purity culture affected their life. But out of all of the effects, I think these are the three that are the most harmful. And again, when I'm talking about where did these resources come from, I'm talking about, gosh, it could be a book that you read. It could be a talk that you heard. It could be, the way your youth minister approached this conversation, or your parents approached this conversation, the priests or pastors you had approached this conversation. Purity culture, we call it purity culture because it was a culture. It was something with its own kind of belief system, with its own phrasing, with its own expectations of attitude and behavior. It was a culture. I'm also thinking of kind of the outward signs and symbols that we had, like purity rings, purity balls, pledge cards for virginity, different things that came up. So yeah, there's just like there's a lot to this. There's a lot of memories surrounding this. There's a lot of behaviors that we can tie to this, but I want to focus on those three things I've already talked to you about. And first, so if we want to explore this idea, this binary of sexuality, you're either lustful or loving, you're either ordered or disordered, you're either experiencing great joy here, great bliss here, or just grave sin and destruction. This kind of fragmentation of what sexuality is and what it can be. When we talked about sexuality within kind of purity culture, we sorted certain behaviors into either category of, I'll say, lustful versus loving. For instance, it was lustful to watch pornography. It was lustful to sleep with a significant other. It was lustful to, I'd say, even like make out with a significant other, or other behaviors that we were talking about. It was, you incited lust if you dressed immodestly, which we'll get into in the second point. And it's not that those behaviors aren't sins, right? They are sins of lust. But often the conversation in purity culture about why we pursued certain sexual sins or why we were susceptible to them kind of missed the mark. There was not a lot of talk of sexual trauma and its effects on how we might sin. There was not a lot of talk about like mixed intentions, I'll say, or like, that you could be in a very loving, committed relationship where you fall into sexual sin. Instead, it was much more binary of, if you, for instance, sleep with your significant other, commit some other form, varying levels of gravity of sexual sin with somebody you've been dating, somebody you love, somebody you're discerning marriage with, they are inherently bad for you. You are inherently bad for them. You're leading them to hell, and it's not a healthy relationship. That was kind of the tone of conversation, right? That like lust was the worst sin you could commit, specifically with another person. And again, that's not to downplay the gravity of sins of lust. They are grave. They are harmful to our soul. They're harmful to another person's soul when we commit them in conjunction with another person. But there was not a lot of discussion about, one, how we might be motivated in committing these sins. And sometimes how even like our desires were good in committing these, our desires were good walking into these moments, even though we ended up allowing our desires to overcome our will in a context where they shouldn't. There just was not, there wasn't really an in-between. There wasn't a recognition of the complexity of sexuality. It was all just very, very grave. And again, that's not to downplay the gravity of sexual sin. That's just to say, maybe we put everything kind of in one pot when we shouldn't. We didn't recognize the varying, levels of sin, but also just like the variety of human experience, why are you led to these things in your relationship? Why are you choosing these particular sins in general? Yeah. So and my mind kind of wanders here to so many different platforms. So I'm gonna try to bring it back here. Um, yeah, I think this did us harm in multiple ways. I think it's very hard to deprogram from thinking something is just inherently lustful. And so this actually didn't set young people up super well for healthy sexual relationships in marriage, oftentimes, because if I've been taught over and over and over, hey, this thing is lustful, it is bad to do this thing. You are lusting if you do this. Then it's very, very hard to switch that when you are married. It's very, very hard to say, okay, now these things are actually healthy and expressive of union. um, yeah, when it's drilled into us that we're either lustful or loving, we still place ourselves in that binary, even when we do have a healthy sexual relationship in a committed marriage. That's one reason why it's pretty destructive. Another one is it doesn't recognize trauma. It doesn't recognize the role of trauma in sexual compulsivity. So when it's either lustful or loving, it's like actually some people watch pornography to dissociate, or some people masturbate to relieve stress. There are multiple reasons why we sexually act out. It's not just lustful behavior. The lust certainly, plays a component in most people's sexual sin, I'd say. It kind of or doesn't recognize the other reasons why people pursue sexually acting out. Again, doesn't mean it's not sinful to do so. It doesn't mean it's not really unhealthy to do so. But if it's either lustful or loving, this is either destruction or joy. We're not recognizing, what people's trauma, or what people's stress, or what people's psychological state does to their choice of sin, I'd say. The last thing I'll say about this is this idea, like creating like this almost like pedestal to put sexuality on, I'll say, or sexual purity on, of like, this is the barometer of a healthy relationship. I think it does a disservice to our growth in wholeness and virtue if we say sexual purity is like the highest good. And I don't think that was explicitly said. It was more implied through how often we talked about it, through kind of the destruction talk of like, yeah, if you're sexually acting out with a partner, you're leading them to hell, you're not good for them. There was not really any talk about like if what other sins could come up in a relationship that could be destructive to that relationship or unhealthy for that relationship. So there was a really big imbalance between sexuality and everything else playing out in our lives, in our relationships. I find it really interesting to use Dante here. So Dante in his Divine Comedy, in both Inferno and Purgatorio, he talks about, Inferno is the one I'll use more, how on like the levels of hell, basically, that Dante travels through with Virgil, lust is actually like pretty much at the, like one of the outer layers of hell. So the topish layer of hell, because it's actually like one of the sins that's in Dante's view, the least grave. I found that to be really interesting when studying the Divine Comedy. And in Purgatorio, they're purified, like the lustful, as they journey towards heaven. And again, like those who are being purified from lust are a little closer on the journey towards heaven than other sins. So it's interesting to just think about that lens when looking at purity culture, is that actually traditionally we've seen this as less grave, or Thomas Aquinas talks about the sins of the flesh actually being less grave than, say, pride, because they're sins of passion. So anyway, we could get into the weeds on that, but I like to use Dante because, yeah, like when in Purgatorio, those who are lustful are purified by walking through fire. So there's like this refinement of the body that's needed in order to enter heaven. But I like that idea a lot, because I think it aligns deeply with the Thomistic attitude of like, this is the sin of the passions. So there's a refinement needed here, but it's not this deep, intense corruption of soul that I think purity culture made it out to be. And I'll talk about the origins of that in just a second. Yes, sorry, redirecting. Again, this is what happens when Rachael gets a solo episode. You guys get taken on a journey. Okay. The second lie of purity culture that I think is most harmful is that men are inherently more lustful, and therefore the duty of women is to protect them from themselves and from women, basically. So this came up a ton in the surveys that I took and in the interviews that I had with women. There were so many women with this kind of rhetoric or these kind of experiences embedded in them. So a lot of messages surrounding virginity, a lot of messages surrounding modesty, a lot of messages surrounding boundaries. And a lot of times this expectation for women, the onus on women to maintain purity, the onus on women to maintain men's purity for them, it could come through messages like, you set the standard in a relationship, like a man will rise up to your standard, or men look to you to know how to behave. You can encourage boys to be men. I think the veiled language here, like it was hard, I'd say, as a teenager to see how truly screwed up that was, to say it lightly. I think this idea that like women set the standard of behavior and then men will rise up to it. And you can measure a real man by how well he ascends to your standard of purity. Number one, that places a horrible responsibility on women to set a very high standard that they themselves cannot uphold because they're imperfect human beings too. And it also, it makes you measure men by how successful they are in purity or not again, taking into account their personal story, their trauma, their history of sexual sin, the help they're receiving, just where they are in their journey with the Lord on this. That's not to say receive behavior that you shouldn't receive from men. That's just to say, perhaps it taught us to fear men and not trust them as women if there was any sign of sexual sin in their story. It also made any woman like Magdala's community serves go into hiding if she was anything other than sexually pure. That's if she lost her virginity either by her sin or by the effect of somebody else's sin, in an abusive situation. Anything with pornography, masturbation, same-sex desires, whatever the case, it made women go into hiding. So this idea that women are more responsible for sexual purity than men, it created a super huge power imbalance that, again, I think is actually quite hard to take into marriage. But it also, I think, created a deep feeling of distrust on the part of women towards men. And then it also, I think it created, I want to say, some laziness in men when it came to purity in their relationships. I've known several men who take the attitude of like, I'll push it as far as I want. Like, she'll tell me when she's uncomfortable. It's just like really not a healthy way to approach dating. I think, we'll have a boundaries episode actually coming out later this season that Annie and I recorded together. And it was great having this conversation about how to have a healthy boundaries conversation with somebody you're dating. But men should contribute just as much to that as women. You should arrive at these boundaries together. Men should be able to communicate what they're struggling with, what they're uncomfortable with, just as much as women. There should be freedom on both sides. But also the seeds of distrust towards men, I don't think serves us well. There's also like a lot of blame, like victim blaming that comes from this, of like, if something does go wrong, it's the woman's fault. She didn't hold the line. She wasn't dressed modestly enough. She was misleading. The blame almost always falls on the woman. I've known too many women to carry this blame, or that carry this blame, I guess is a better way to put that. But I think the worst situations that show this is when a woman is a victim of abuse, assault, rape, and she blames herself, or she is blamed by others for like a horrific thing that's been committed against her. Because again, she's the standard of purity. What did she do wrong? So that's the problem with this, is if women are expected to be quote unquote more sexually pure than men, or more naturally sexually pure than men, that means when something goes wrong, the question's asked first of the woman. So there's a deep disorder in that, because again, this should be a place of mutuality. This should be a place of supporting one another, receiving one another, and also believing people when they've had adverse experiences.
The Magdala podcast is sponsored by the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. The Catholic Theology Show covers themes such as the value of a Catholic higher education, religious liberty, how to pray, the philosophies of St. Thomas Aquinas, and more. Stream episodes on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and learn more by visiting the link below.
The third negative effect that I want to explore is that marriage will solve all your problems. I laugh, not just because I am married and it doesn't solve all my problems, but because I just remember so much of this kind of rhetoric in my upbringing. And again, I'm talking more about like a church upbringing, not necessarily what my parents gave me. I feel like my parents actually gave me quite a realistic picture of marriage in so many ways. I'm very grateful to them for that. A positive, but yes, a recognition that marriage is a healing vocation. So I think a lot of the purity culture rhetoric, including in Catholicism, was based around this tenet of saving sex for marriage. That was the big end all be all goal, was to be a virgin when you got married, or sometimes in some conversations it was a recommitted virgin if you've already lost your virginity. But that's what the purity rings were for. It was everywhere. It was like save sex for marriage was the goal. It's still often, I see it all the time, this articulated goal of what sexual purity is saving sex for marriage. And again, that's not a bad goal. That's a very good one. But it took a while for me to see why it bothered me. And it's because it's such a collapse of what sexuality is meant to be. Marriage does not solve all of our sexual issues. In fact, it may bring even more of them up because, like I said, marriage is a healing vocation. It's meant to be a mirror to you so that Christ can refine you. But this whole save sex for marriage kind of, being the end all be all of purity culture, it doesn't feel very Catholic in the sense that Catholicism has always valued this dual nature of human sexuality, of unity and procreation, but it also, it really values chastity through continence, or celibacy, and chastity through marriage and the married sexual state. So I think this whole like save sex for marriage is the height of sexual purity. It's the height of chastity. It really ignores this kind of two-toned theology that we've actually always had. I would say John Paul II really, really brought it home in his theology of the body, of why we value it. We've always valued celibacy and chastity through celibacy. So this idea of, hey, just like buckle it down right now, go through the difficulty right now, go through the striving right now. And in marriage, you're going to be rewarded with a wonderful, blissful sex life if you just get it right on the front end. I think, that's incredibly disordered. And it creates also this like idolization of married sexuality that I don't think is fair to a person as they enter into marriage. And I don't think it's fair to their spouse. Sexuality, whether inside or outside of marriage, is again a complex place. It's a place influenced by our experiences, our trauma, our psychological state. There's a few experts that say that we work out non-sexual things sexually. So there's a lot that we take into our sexual experiences, whether positive or negative. Sorry, you can probably hear my toddler playing in the background. So I think this idolization, of married sexuality, it just creates expectations on both spouses that are not fair. I think it can be tied in with that man versus woman kind of experience of like women hold the line of sexual purity. Women are these like perfect virginal goddesses, men are animals. This kind of ties into that, but it places so much expectation on the fulfillment, like the sexual fulfillment that you'll feel in marriage, where that's something that you work out over time as a couple, as you grow closer together emotionally and spiritually over your marriage, as you go through life experiences together, like becoming parents, like making big decisions, like going through tragedy, going through like major transitions, major joys, like all of that contributes to sexual fulfillment in marriage. So it's not this like you enter into marriage and all of a sudden like sex is super wonderful and fulfilling. Um, it can be, but it's also like it's just not very realistic. So this you kind of dangle a carrot in front of a whole generation of people saying like if you just behave yourself, you get this reward. Yeah, that's like really objectifying of spouses. It's also, yeah, it's a very strange idolization of a one aspect of marriage that actually takes quite a bit of time. Um, but I see a lot of people still carrying around this attitude. Um, Also, if your sexual sin involves habits like pornography, masturbation, fantasy, anything like that, automatically getting married does not automatically take that away. Especially if it's like a regular compulsive habit and addiction, you may need some serious help in order to overcome that, in order to order your thoughts and actions more, closely with your sexual integrity. Like that takes time and effort. Marriage does not take that away just because you are having sex with a person. It doesn't make it go away. Again, that kind of places your spouse in the position of being the locus of your sexual acting out, not a place for self-gift. So there's that issue too. Anyway, a couple more notes just from my surveys with women that I find really interesting. I asked one of the questions that I asked, I asked many, but one of the questions I asked was what phrases or concepts from purity culture do you recognize? Check all that apply. The highest ones that women said they had kind of taken in from purity culture at 88% was the statement, men are visual, women are emotional. So 88% of women recognize that statement. They had received that in their upbringing on, sexual education and chastity, that men are visual. Wow. Women are emotional. So again, that kind of contributes to that male female binary of like the sexual purity is not going to be hard for women. It's difficult for men. Therefore, women need to pick up the slack. One of the other phrases that women recognized and identified with was women need to dress modestly so that men don't lust after them. If you dress immodestly, you're causing men to sin. Again, that contributes to that male versus female experience of sexual purity rather than mutual support. Modesty is a hard one for me to talk about, not because I don't believe in its value. I don't believe it's a virtue. It's because I feel like I never make anybody happy by talking about it. So I'm not going to get into the weeds here on what I think modesty is or is not. Here's what I think the problem with this kind of idea is that modesty is first an interior disposition. It's an interior virtue that influences your exterior action. It influences more exterior action than just how you dress. So the collapse of the definition of modesty to solely appearance really bothers me. I think the way we talked about it also taught women that sacred parts of their body are not necessarily sacred, but rather shameful. Again, making it just very difficult for women to be at home in their bodies. It also places the responsibility for men's lust solely on women. That also really bothers me. This whole like causing men to stumble, causing men to sin is a really, really loaded statement to place on women. Another kind of an additional point to that is like we often started talking about modesty with girls when they were very young. So like kind of prepubescent or pubescent girls. That's like really harmful to a girl's body image. This idea of like you're coming into this body, it's changing a lot. It goes through I'd say more like visually significant changes than men, obviously. And so like you come into this body and you're told immediately, like, actually you're responsible for the purity of every male around you. That can make the male gaze incredibly terrifying for girls, for young girls, when it shouldn't necessarily be. I think we should be able to identify harmful gazes, but I think this idea of like you're responsible for all the men around you. You should be afraid of interacting with men because you should be afraid that you're going to lead them into sin. It just, yeah, there's so much I could say about this, and I just want to be so careful. It sucked. It sucked. And it did not teach women that modesty was more about understanding their dignity and exuding that dignity through how we speak, how we dress, how we conduct ourselves. it wasn't about that. It was much more about like, you should be afraid of your own body because um, any revelation of your body is too much. Um, and that, yeah, it was incredibly sad. And also there's so many different lines of like what, when it came to the clothing of like, what is modest, what is not modest. And there was the whole like modest is hottest thing. It was just so confusing. Um, and just this total collapse of, yeah, sexual purity being solely on how much of women's bodies were exposed and how much was not, not taking into account different body types, different cultures, different styles. And also just that men should take responsibility for their actions. This isn't to say women shouldn't be considerate of men. Please don't hear me say that. But this idea of you're causing men to sin, it does not help young men take responsibility for their thoughts, their actions. All that being said, soapbox, put that away. One final one, just to kind of back this up, or actually two final ones that back up kind of the harmful lies of purity culture that I've laid out here. 81% of women recognized the phrase sex is God's greatest gift to spouses. So this kind of goes back into that marriage, sexuality within marriage is an idol. That sex is God's greatest gift to spouses is kind of wild. This idea, it is a gift. It's a beautiful gift. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift. But this idea of like, yes, this is the crux of your marriage. That's again, dangling that carrot, and it can set you up to be very, very disappointed when your experiences are actually quite normal and quite human because you're just growing. You're growing in this new piece of a relationship with somebody. Or it's a space of, encountering trauma, encountering broken places that need healing. It's very normal in a sex life, or imbalances because of hormones, postpartum, babies, so many different things here. This idea of God's greatest gift can set you up to be pretty disappointed if you don't have a realistic picture. Within that too, 81% of women recognize the phrase, your virginity is the greatest gift that you give in a marriage. I've written on this. I recorded podcast episodes on this. And this is BS. And it drives me crazy when I hear this kind of stuff. I was a virgin when I got married. I'm very blessed by that. It was a very valuable gift to give. I was grateful to give that gift. But I have so many friends and so many women within Magdala who have walked through this lie of this being the greatest gift that they give their husbands if they are called to marriage. And gosh, it does so much harm to a woman's recognition of the dignity of her soul and of her very life. Like that's the greatest gift you give in a marriage is your very life, your very self. Your virginity is not yourself. It is a good gift, but it is not you. And it's not your value. So this was sold to women a lot, especially. This was sold way more to women than to men, though it also, arguably was sold to men too, is that this is the greatest gift that you give in a marriage. And that if you have lost your virginity prior to marriage, you're inherently kind of relegated to this second tier of happiness, especially in sexuality in your marriage. Very upsetting. However, Magdala has more content on that. So I will we'll link them in the show notes and I will move on to a different point. The final stat that I think is, or was most popular, I'll say, is this idea of men want sex, women want romance. I've also recorded another podcast episode on that. That's a very strange binary that comes up a lot. And it also sets people up to be ashamed of their desires, ashamed of their experiences, to stay in habits of sin because they're unwilling to get help because they don't fit this mold, they don't fit the stereotype. But yeah, it sets you up for some weirdness. So anyway, here's some thoughts on how to heal from purity culture, because I feel like one 35-minute podcast episode is just the beginning of what was packed in here. Or packed into years of catechesis that took this tone. First, I think we can recognize that sexual sin is very grave at varying levels, and it's worthy of repenting of. It's necessary that you repent of it. And it's necessary that we seek and receive help to overcome it, whether that is just in prayer, whether that's through accountability, therapy, group work, whatever we need in order to overcome these things, we should find it. However, sexual purity and chastity, like any other virtues, are perfected over the whole of a life, not by our 20s, right? In so many, we're actually in all of the virtues, we're taught that we build them up, right? Over the course of our life, we become more and more refined, more and more perfected. Only sexual purity do we treat like we have it at the outset of our life, and we slowly chip at it over the course of our life with every mistake. It's like you're handed sexual purity and you chip away at it, or you stain it. You stain this virtue the more mistakes you make. And that's just not, I don't think that's accurate. I think chastity is integration. I think integration takes a lifetime, especially in a fragmented sexual culture like ours. Next, I'd say that men and women are both susceptible, obviously, to the pitfalls of lustful or just unhealthy compulsive behavior in their sexuality, because we're all sexual beings. So this is a sacred space where we can act destructively, we can desecrate it, we can act in accord with virtue, or we can act with like mixed intentions and outcomes, and there can be confusion. There can be a good intention, a bad action that doesn't make it a good action, by the way. There can just be so much in our hearts and our bodies and our minds here when it comes to our sexual experiences. So all in all, it's a beautiful but complex place that God, again, must work at to achieve integration, to achieve unity and order in over the whole of a life. And so men and women do each other a disservice by listening to stereotypes that women can hold this line better than men, and that men are animalistic in their desires anyway. That discounts the reality of both men's and women's experiences and both men's and women's good desires and their journeys towards virtue. So growing in virtue here is a joint effort. Men and women should be assisting one another, truly assisting one another, carrying this load together, and also just affirming each other in our effort here. And last, I'd say marriage is not the height of fulfilled sexuality. Definitely not in the Catholic framework, as I've talked about. In our view, chastity through continence or through the married state, they're both significant. But continence for the kingdom actually bears special significance because of its foreshadowing of the eschaton. So in eternity, we all belong to God, body and soul for all of eternity. We totally are united with God. And chastity through continence, setting aside sexual action in one's life, it's a hearkening to what's to come, is that like your body, your soul belongs entirely to the Lord and is entirely united to him. However, chastity in the married state is a complement to this because it's supposed to be a picture of unity, right? It's a picture of God's design for communion and that he ultimately wants with us. Sexuality is supposed to be a picture for that. And chastity in both states is refined in a person by God. But in the married state, it's not the marriage that refines. It's a tool in God's hand. It's again a healing vocation. He uses it to heal us, to integrate us, to bring our pieces together. And a couple journeys through that brokenness together, accepting each other's stories, their current struggles, their past struggles, but also like in anticipating hope, anticipating Christ's love and eternity together, and trusting that God will continue to refine by his grace what needs to be refined and needs to be ordered. But marriage is not the height of fulfilled sexuality. This earth, like it's impossible to find that height. Our height is not meant to be just in a sexual sphere. It's in eternity with Jesus, our whole selves, body, soul, everything belonging totally to God. So if you're processing purity culture, guess what? I am too. More to come. I have a hard time not talking about this. My poor husband hears about purity culture a few times a week at this point. But I have more research to share with you guys in the future. But yeah, thanks for joining the Magdala podcast, and we will catch you guys soon.
Thanks for listening. Check out more podcast episodes, blog posts, and how to get involved with Magdala by visiting our website, magdalaministries.org. Your love is meant to change the world. We hope to see you soon.